He said there are over 700,000 words in the English language. Some of those words are good and some of them aren't so good. One word that falls into the former category of being a good word is the word thanks. And a word that I don't use often enough, but we always want to give thanks to God for every good and perfect gift, the blessing of salvation through Jesus, the opportunity of eternal life. Thankful to God for preaching schools and schools that emphasize Bible teaching, such as the Northwest Florida School of Biblical Studies, the elders here at Milestone, to Guyton for directing the school, and he and Ray serving as ministers for the church here, and the faculty and every member of the congregation, everybody that pitches in, everybody that supports this work in any way, we say thanks, and in all things to God be the glory. Somebody once said a little encouragement goes a long way. I'm always encouraged by the ongoing work here at Milestone. Appreciate our son Adam being able to be here and the other students to help them know more about the Bible and effectively pass it on to others. In this lectureship, we are once again considering church and religious history. Whenever we study history, of course, we're looking back. Looking back can be helpful. Looking back can be harmful. Looking back can be helpful. We can learn a lot of life's lessons as we look back. I can learn to persevere by looking back at others who persevered. Those who give up are a dime a dozen, it said. Anybody can give up. Giving up's easy. But rare are people who keep at it through the midst of hardship and heartache. I can learn to sacrifice by looking back at the lives of others who sacrificed, some even giving the ultimate sacrifice of their life for the causes in which they believed. We can avoid many mistakes if we look back at the past. It's often been said if we don't learn from the mistakes of the past, we're doomed to repeat them. One definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. Learning from the mistakes of the past can help us break the cycle of continuing in those mistakes. So looking back can be helpful, though it can also be harmful. We could ask Mrs. Lot. She was literally told not to look back. She did, and the rest is history. For good reason, the Lord says, remember Lot's wife. I cannot press forward if I continually live in the past. Paul had a past he'd just as soon have forgotten. And even though God had forgiven Paul, Paul could never undo his past. Certain memories still haunted him. But Paul's mindset was, let's forget the things that are behind and let's reach forth to the things that are before. That's certainly good counsel for us today. Our lesson this time is religion and the founding fathers. And to discuss this, we've got to look back at a slice of the history of our country. And we look back at these men who helped create our nation. This is a tough assignment. Number one, we're simply at the mercy of historians and to see what they say on these matters. I can't walk up to George Washington and interview him on his religious beliefs. He's been dead over 200 years. I can't turn to the Bible and say, wonder what John Quincy Adams said about religion. The Bible, of course, was written centuries before he lived. And so we understand, of course, that we rely on historians. And another problem is historians are not always in agreement on these matters. Someone else might present the same material that I'm presenting, and using the viewpoint of other historians might come at this at a completely different angle. Good news is that this lesson has no bearing on our salvation. This is a win-win lesson. We don't do any harm either way as to what we decide on this. We don't misrepresent anybody, but at the same time, we're simply at the mercy of historians as to what they actually believed. We want to do three things. We want to start out with some preliminaries. We want to look at some religious beliefs of our founding fathers, and we want to wrap up with some application for us. Number one, preliminaries. Again, religion and the founding fathers. What was or is a founding father? If I look at the dictionary, I find that a founding father is a person who starts or helps start a movement or institution. He was one of the founding fathers of criminology. He was the founding father of the study of botany. Who were the founding fathers? That's perhaps a better question. We're assuming that for purpose of this study that we're talking about the founding fathers of this country, the United States. We know that other nations also had founding fathers, and their constituents are proud of them. Sweden had its founding fathers, Spain did, France did. Most any nation had people to help kickstart that country. But since we're in the United States, we'll limit our discussion to some of our founding fathers. Further, the term founding fathers is applied in different ways. Some apply it to the first English settlers in North America, others to those who were members of the convention that drew up the U.S. Constitution in 1787, and some say the founding fathers should be that generation that began at the Declaration of Independence and onward, a very broad constituency there. Some say that Warren G. Harding, our nation's 29th president, coined the phrase founding fathers in 1918. Others say, though, that there's a newspaper clipping where the phrase was used as early as 1895. Further, historians do not agree on who should be in the list of founding fathers, who to include, who to omit. Some say there are 13, some 12, some 10, some limit the number to 6. We're going to consider 7 founding fathers in this study: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and George Washington. For purposes of our study, we must limit our overview of founding fathers to these 7. You probably can imagine there are people who object for our even using the phrase founding fathers. Some say this is an elitist phrase that ignores the contributions of thousands of others who likewise worked and sacrificed to establish the nation. Why list the names of 7 and ignore the names of thousands of others who did just as much, if not more, than these 7? Well, at the end of the day, you've got to leave somebody out, and I don't know that anybody's feelings will be hurt in that. Maybe their ancestors might. Some say the phrase founding fathers is a sexist phrase because this fails to recognize the contributions of women. Why not founding women or founding persons? At the time, women were not allowed to fight, hold office, vote, or serve on juries. But still, you think about the contributions of women at that time, like Abigail Adams, Dolly Madison. If you use the phrase founding fathers, you eliminate their work. Some say the phrase founding fathers neglects again the efforts of those who succeeded these men. Our nation may not have lasted 100 years had it just been based on these 7 founding fathers. And so you don't want to ignore others who contributed as well. Well, when it's all said and done, you're not going to please everybody. And our apologies if you're offended by the phrase founding fathers. I try not to wear my feelings on my sleeves, and I've got a lot more things to worry about than that, but to each his own. Let's look at a few views of these founding fathers. Some say that they are champions of Christianity. Others say that to hold them up as a pinnacle of Christianity is likely as false as George Washington's teeth. One makes this claim: America is not a Christian nation and never has been. We'll talk more about that in a few moments. Were the founding fathers fierce separationist men who wrote the First Amendment to prevent the establishment of religion, or were they relatively cheerful Christian soldiers? Or does the truth lie somewhere in between? Many refer to and quote from the founding fathers to support their agenda. One says that those on the political left and right often quote the founding fathers to serve their purposes. He continues that the founding fathers are a little like Scripture. You can use that to whatever purpose you wish. A lot of quotations that are used on both sides of the argument are often used out of context. Keep that in mind. We want to keep in mind that at times we are guilty of putting men on pedestals and idolizing them, making heroes out of them. We tend to stereotype people. Our founding fathers were upstanding, moral men to whom we should look up, admire, and venerate. But when we look at the history and the facts, we're somewhat let down. These men, great as they may have been, were still more mortal and sinners like all of us. We know that God, when He wrote the Word, included both the faith and flaws of characters therein. That's a mark of Bible inspiration. Abraham, father of the Jews and of the faithful, lied on more than one occasion. David, a man after God's own heart, committed adultery, murder, and deception. God depicted, though, the characters in His Word, as we would say, warts and all, but we tend not to do that. We so desperately want human heroes to idolize, and we gloss over their faults. We glamorize people. So keep in mind the founding fathers, as great as their contributions may have been, were still just men like us. They were sinners. As we look at the religious beliefs of our founding fathers, and we may be surprised as to exactly what they believed and did not believe, we excuse them by saying, well, they just didn't know any better or were products of their time, but they had the same Bible that we have. We'll see that many of them chose to let others study the Bible for them, a mistake that we don't want to make. Understand that people change their minds in the course of a lifetime. When I quote someone, am I pulling a quote when they were young or when they were near the time of their death? Does it matter? Well, if I want to give an honest appraisal of their beliefs, again, considering that beliefs evolve and change over a lifetime, we need to understand that, again, things can change. I think about my life. I'm on record as saying I would never marry, never live in Mississippi, never drive a Dodge. Somebody could say, well, here's a sermon that Wayne Cox preached after he's dead. He never lived in Mississippi, he never married, he never drove a Dodge. They would be wrong. Even though they have the evidence of my quotes, they fail to consider that I changed my mind, thankfully. I did marry, and I've lived in Mississippi longer than I've lived anywhere else. Unfortunately, I did buy a couple of Dodges. I wish I'd kept my vow on that, but be that as it may. Remember that people can change their minds. Whenever we quote people, keep in mind that they can indeed change their minds, especially when it comes to religion. That is vital to keep in mind as we look at the beliefs of founding fathers. Life evolves and belief evolves. To determine the religion of our founding fathers, we look to history. When we do, we find a conglomeration of beliefs. We might better title our study Religions and Our Founding Fathers instead of Religion singular. We'll start with the foundingest father of all, George Washington. He, of course, served as the first president of the United States. We, I think, are more familiar with George Washington maybe than the others. If we're poor people like I am, we see George Washington all the time. He's on the face of the $1 bill. He's on the face of the quarter. And so we see him all the time, especially if we're poor. George Washington, understand that sometimes we exaggerate the exploits of these men long after they've died, like the fish story. You know, the fella catches the fish, gets bigger and bigger and bigger the longer after he's caught it. Sort of like the tales of some of these individuals, especially George Washington. We know that lying is wrong and honesty is right. Sometimes we illustrate that in our sermons by the example of young George Washington. When he chopped down his father's cherry tree with a hatchet, his dad confronted him and he said, well, I've got to be honest and I cannot tell a lie. That's a great illustration, if only it were true. That's actually legend and not fact. His religious beliefs, well, Washington was indeed a religious man. He was raised in Anglican, Church of England. He really wasn't the best church attender like a lot of folks today. He wanted his army to be religious men. He did speak of God, but in Masonic and deistic connotations. He spoke of God as the grand architect, capital G, capital A. That, again, is a Masonic phrase. Some believe that Washington was religious merely because it helped him politically. Many believe that Washington was a deist. Deism is a belief in God, yes, that God created everything, but God does not perform miracles. He does not answer prayers. He does not intervene in the lives of people. He's sort of an aloof God. God just sort of wound the universe up and he walked off letting creation fend for itself. He doesn't get involved. That's what many of these men believe, but that's not the God of the Bible. Others disagree. Some historians say that Washington was a devout Christian. He spoke of providence, God involving himself in the affairs of men. Well, Washington definitely had Masonic connections, and again, he refused to receive communion later in life, and again, that might lead more toward the deistic aspects of his life. We think of John Adams. We think of his contributions to the nation. He was our nation's second president. He, again, was a religious man. He changed his views, raised a Congregationalist, but he changed to a Unitarian. He would attend the Mass of Catholicism. On one occasion, he went with George Washington to view a Catholic Mass. He wrote a letter to his wife about what he witnessed. Here's an example of a dishonest quote from that letter he wrote. He said, This afternoon's entertainment was the most awful. What the writer's not revealed as the word awful, as John Adams used it, was full of awe, awe-inspiring, not terrible. We use the word awful to mean terrible, like maybe you're thinking this lecture. But the word awful that he used, if you read the rest of the letter, he was impressed by the Catholic Mass. We're not defending Catholicism, but we're saying it is blatantly dishonest to pull a quote from somebody out of context as this writer did. And we don't want to be guilty of that on either side of this issue. And so we think about Washington, we think about John Adams, we think about Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, of course, was involved in composing the Declaration of Independence. He became the third president of our country in 1801. Jefferson was a, quote, religious man. He was really more aligned with deism than he was Christianity. He took the Bible and really sort of adopted the cut, paste, and move method of the Bible, trying to align the life of Christ. He did not mean for this Bible to be published, but his great-granddaughter sold this to the Smithsonian Institution 70-something years after his death. But again, in Jefferson's Bible, he removed all references to the miraculous, such as the virgin birth, such as the miracles that Jesus performed, such as the resurrection of the dead. Well, again, Jefferson did believe that the teachings of Jesus were beneficial to society, and we want to emphasize that. But by the same token, he did not believe in the deity of Jesus. He wrote a letter to John Adams and said this: "For God, whom you and I acknowledge and admire, creator and benefactor of the world, that's a great thing, but most people who quote that eagerly fail to quote the rest of that same letter where Jefferson denied the virgin birth of Jesus. He said, the day will come when the mystical generation of Jesus by the Supreme Being in the womb of a virgin will be classed in the class of a fable." And so again, Jefferson, while he thought that Jesus' teachings were, well, yes, beneficial, again rejected the miraculous and the deity of the Lord. Benjamin Franklin, we think about his contributions to the nation. He helped draft the Declaration of Independence. He took part in the Constitutional Convention that led to the United States Constitution. His religious beliefs, well, his father taught him Calvinism, but at age 15, Franklin sort of flopped and said, I'm a thorough deist, and yet he still believed in providence, the power of prayer. Ezra Stiles wanted to sort of clarify exactly, Franklin, what are your religious beliefs? And he wrote him a letter. Franklin wrote back, I believe in one God, the creator of the universe, that he governs by his providence. Well, that's great, but if you read on in the letter, Franklin says, as to Jesus of Nazareth, my opinion of whom you desire, I think the system of morals and his religion as he left them to us, the best the world has ever seen. That's great, but I have some doubts as to his deity. And he would say, well, I'm not going to study that for now. I'll find out in the not too distant future whether Jesus is divine or not. I'll wait until I die. And that's obviously a sad thing to do. John Jay was a delegate to the First Continental Congress in 1774, chosen as president in 1778. He negotiated the Jay Treaty of 1794, and again did a lot of good works to help with the founding of our nation. John Jay was an Anglican, or a member of the Church of England. He worked diligently to abolish slavery. Kudos for that. He served as vice president of the American Bible Society, and he felt very strongly about the role of Christianity in the life of the new nation. He held home Bible studies for his family in his home. My personal belief, of the 7 founding fathers we're looking at, John Jay probably embraced Christianity more closely than did the rest. And that I say that with a very usage of the word Christianity. And so you think about his religious beliefs, and again, probably more aligned with Christianity than some of the rest. And so we think about the contributions then of John Jay then and some of these others. James Madison. James Madison, as far as our nation is concerned, Madison became America's 4th president, and he made a major contribution to the ratification of the Constitution by writing with Hamilton and Jay the Federalist Papers, or essays, a series of 85 essays in defense of the Constitution and Republican government. Some called Madison the father of the Constitution, but to his credit he said, "Don't call me that. I'm a team player." Others were involved just as much as I was. James Madison's religious beliefs. Raised Episcopalian, but we don't know a lot about his religious beliefs. Some believe that he adhered to Christianity's doctrinal pursuits. Others believe he was more a deist. He, again, drafted an article stating that all men are entitled to the free exercise of religion, and for that we're very, very thankful. Alexander Hamilton, his contributions to the nation. Well, we think about Hamilton. He was New York's delegate to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, major author of the Federalist Papers, but most people probably remember Hamilton by the way he died. He dueled Aaron Burr. Dueling was sort of a sadistic sport then. If you had somebody challenged you to a duel, it was an act of chivalry to accept the challenge. More likely an act of stupidity in our minds at least, but he was killed by Aaron Burr in a duel. That's how he died. We remember him for that. Religiously, he was a Presbyterian at an early age, but he wasn't much of a worship attender. His family worshiped with the Episcopal Church. Some called him a lukewarm Anglican. And again, many believe that he also was influenced by deism, the belief that God sort of wound things up and left things for men to fend for themselves. Lessons we learn, well, number one, we thank these men. We're not knocking these men. We're not judging these men. God is their judge. We probably would not be here were it not for these founding fathers. They helped, again, sort of kickstart our country, as we say. There are things and people that we tend to take for granted or forget, and we don't want to take these men for granted, and we thank them and we honor them for the work they did. By the same token, these men were just men. They were sinners like every one of us, not worthy of our worship. We're thankful for the work they did, but we do not idolize, deify, or put these men on a pedestal. If we do, we look at the facts, then we become disillusioned and let down. Jesus ought to be our hero, no matter what country we live in. Jesus is our model, our mentor, our maker. If I pattern my life after any other than the Lord, I've set my sights way too low. Jesus died for the world, not just for the United States. He tasted death not just for Americans, but every man, Hebrews 2:9. Our country is not the chosen nation of God today. No earthly nation is a chosen nation of God. We're part of the church, and anybody can be a part of the church, Jew or Gentile, American, Russian, Chinese, Indian, or Israeli, doesn't matter. It may be there are more Christians living in the United States than any other country in the world. I don't know that. But by the same token, Jesus died for everybody. And so, another nation's founding fathers mean as much to them as ours mean to us. America is not a Christian nation and never has been. We bristle when we hear that. But in the Bible usage of the word Christian, that is a true statement. Most of our founding fathers, even in the denominational usage of the word Christian, were not Christians. Some of the principles they espoused were Bible principles, yes, and some were in accordance with Christ's teachings, but not believing in the Christ of the Bible, it's hard to imagine they're establishing a Christian nation or Christian heritage. What they believed or didn't believe has no bearing on my faith or religion. What they believe religiously is a moot point as far as our salvation is concerned. I'm a Christian not because of George Washington, Alexander Campbell, or James Cox. I'm a Christian because of Jesus Christ. If I make it to heaven, it'll not be on the coattails of anybody else. It'll be by the grace of God, the sacrifice of Jesus, and my faithful response to that offer of salvation. We need to think for ourselves. We need to study for ourselves. We don't want to be anybody's mental robot or jump on bandwagons. Men may have founded our country, but Jesus is the founder of our faith. We are proud to be citizens of America. but our prime citizenship is in heaven. Like Abraham, we look for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. As Christians, we want to pay our taxes. We want to be upstanding citizens. We want to lend our support to society, especially in a Christian way. And of course, as we live, we are striving even more diligently to be a part of an eternal kingdom in heaven in the hereafter. We appreciate your taking the time to listen and weigh these thoughts, and again, consider the evidence, and in all things we give God Almighty the glory.